Hi, everybody. I'm Martin Hellman, and this was supposed to be a joint talk with my wife, Dorothie, but she wasn't up to doing it today, so I'm going to do it by myself. But she's the real star of the journey I'm going to describe, and I really miss not having her here beside me. So let's start with a story that occurred 30 years ago. Dorothie and I had driven up to San Francisco to do some fun sightseeing, and it was time to get to our next stop. So Dorothie reaches into the glove compartment and pulls out the map. Yeah, this was 30 years ago, so it was a paper map. And she's looking at the map, and I did something really, really stupid. I reached over and took the map out of her hands without asking. Oh, God. Not only was this rude, this was one of her pet peeves. So she got furious. She storms out of the car, slams the door, and goes stomping off like she's never coming back. Well, she did come back. She took a while to cool down. And when she thought she'd cooled down enough that she could be in the same car with me, she got back in. And what does she find? I've got my head buried in the map. Now, I was trying to pretend that nothing had happened. I knew something had happened, but I still hadn't figured out what I'd done wrong, and I was afraid of stepping on another landmine. But to her, it seemed like I was ignoring her. So this brought back her anger even worse than before, and so without thinking, she rips the map out of my hands, and she starts tearing it to pieces, shredding it all over the car and all over me. So now there's a moment of truth. I could escalate this argument. I mean, I have the perfect opening. I could tell her how stupid she'd been for tearing up the map. And not a smart move, right? And fortunately, somehow I got outside of my own head, and it's almost like I could look down on the scene from above and see it as the ridiculous comedy that it actually was. So, oh God, I laughed. And then she laughed. She saw the humor in it too, thank God. And then the two of us had to get down on the floor of the car and pick up those shreds that had been our map, which was now a jigsaw puzzle, and piece it back together again. Similar ridiculous arguments occur at the international level, but there's a big difference there. Those can end in war. And in a world that is bristling with 14,000 nuclear weapons. You didn't hear me wrong, 14,000 of them. If we keep making stupid mistakes like that, it's only a matter of time before one of those wars escalates out of control and leads to this. Our tearing up the map story is a metaphor for what's needed both individually and internationally. Dorothie and I each brought unconscious maps to our relationship, and they had us repeatedly driving off cliffs. But because those were the only maps we had, the only maps we knew, it was really scary to tear them up. But when we found the courage to do that, we then had the opportunity to piece together a new map that brought us joy. As we worked on our relationship, we came to see that the same problems that caused many fights in our marriage also were causing many wars in the world. Things like not listening, disrespect, thinking there's only one solution, mine. When the problems are described that way, the solution becomes obvious. We need to do the opposite. We needed to work really hard at listening to one another. We needed to respect each other, especially when we disagreed. And we needed to recognize that the world is full of wonderful solutions, just waiting for us to discover them. Those are all part of what we call holistic thinking, taking in the bigger picture. The new international map also requires a shift to holistic thinking. In the nuclear age, national security is becoming inseparable from global security. As just one example, the more we threaten Russia, the less secure we, the United States, become. After all, they have 7,000 nuclear weapons. Here's the main thing to remember for getting started. Believing that peace is possible is the on-ramp to the new map. If we don't believe peace is possible, we'll never get there. And if individuals like us never get there, neither will society. Changes in the course of human history have always started with a few courageous individuals who were willing to challenge deeply held but utterly mistaken societal beliefs. Mark Twain said it really well. They didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. Dorothie and I know that world peace is possible because we transformed a really turbulent marriage that was on the brink of divorce 35 years ago into one where we haven't had a single fight or even mistreated each other in over 15 years. A relationship like that was as inconceivable to us back then, especially to me, as world peace is to most people today. In the nuclear era, learning to resolve conflicts holistically will do much more than just get us out of personal pain. It literally will help save the world. To save the world, the first thing we need to do is to stop blaming other nations and trying to change their behavior, because the real power we have is for changing ourselves. That's why in what follows, I'm going to focus on America's mistakes, not because we're the only nation to make them. Then we need to apply the new map's holistic thinking, even, maybe especially, with seemingly impossible nations. So what's the most impossible nation of all today? North Korea a good choice? Because I'm going to pick that nation, what you're going to hear is likely to surprise you. So I'm going to stick to easily verifiable facts. Let's look at how a lack of holistic thinking, not listening, not respecting, thinking our solution is the only one, the same thing that caused so much trouble in our marriage, also caused major problems in our relationship with North Korea. Not listening. 2 years ago, North Korea proposed that it would halt its nuclear tests if we would stop our annual war games with South Korea. They see those war games as preparations for our invading them. Instead of listening, our State Department rejected the offer as inappropriately linking the two issues. What about disrespect? Let's see. Putting North Korea in the axis of evil, was that a term of endearment? No way. If I put Dorothie in the axis of evil, I would have a huge price to pay. We've just seen how a lack of holistic thinking sabotaged, that's what it did. A lack of holistic thinking sabotaged our relationship with North Korea. But what about the current crisis? Fortunately, holistic thinking resolved an almost identical dispute back in 1994. So think back. Bill Clinton's the president, and I didn't know it at the time. Most Americans didn't know it at the time, but he was this close to attacking North Korea over its nuclear weapons program. Former President Jimmy Carter went over to North Korea as a private citizen, and he got them to agree to a deal that, among other things, prevented them from extracting plutonium that they needed to do their first nuclear test. Unfortunately, 8 years later, we shot ourselves in the foot by tearing up that agreement. They started extracting plutonium again, and they did their first nuclear test 4 years later in 2006. Former President Carter was able to do what the sitting President Bill Clinton could not. He could use holistic thinking and incorporate North Korea's perspective with our own. Why? Because he didn't have to worry about getting reelected in 2 years. How did Carter exercise holistic thinking? He showed respect, he listened, and he came up with a solution that incorporated both nations' needs. He showed respect just by going to North Korea. Usually, we shun them. He listened. North Korea wanted better relations with the United States as a hedge against China. So the agreement promised better relations. Unfortunately, those better relations never materialized, adding to North Korea's feeling that we've cheated them. And the third holistic aspect of Carter's approach was to craft an agreement that was attractive to both sides. Holistic thinking gives us tremendous power for dealing with seemingly impossible nations, even North Korea, but only if we, the public, will reward our elected officials for thinking holistically rather than punishing them at the ballot box. We actually have to change first, because the people we call our leaders actually follow our lead. One of the questions that Dorothie and I get all the time is, how does it work when only one party to the conflict brings holistic thinking to bear on it? So I'm going to shift gears and go back to the personal side and tell you an in-law story. Those are always fun. When Dorothie and I decided to get married, one of the few things she knew about my parents, she hadn't met them, one of the few things she knew about my parents was they didn't want us to get married. They thought we were too young. She was from California. She was a California beach girl. I was a boy from the Bronx. So imagine her immense relief, her immense surprise when the day after she meets my father, they're sitting in the kitchen, and he says to her, "Dorothie, you remind me of my mother." Dorothie thinks, hallelujah, this is going to work. I remind him of his mother. So she says, "Why, thank you." And my father turns to her and says, "I didn't like my mother." Believe it or not, that was not the worst part of the relationship. And it got so painful for Dorothie that after a while she just stopped going to visit. But then, as she and I brought holistic thinking to bear on our marriage, and it worked wonders, she decided she could use holistic thinking to solve the relationship problems she had with my parents, even though she was the only one doing it. So what did she do? She went back for a visit, and she worked really hard at listening to them. She respected the cultural differences, and what I think was most important, she realized that her old approach wasn't working, so she came up with a new one. Instead of taking what they said personally, she focused on making them feel loved. And let me tell you, they loved feeling loved. That worked miracles where nothing else had worked. As that story shows, holistic thinking is a power tool for getting out of pain, even if only one person uses it. Of course, it works far, far better if both people do. Dorothie and I recently celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. Thank you. But even more importantly, we recaptured that true love. It's amazing, the true love that we felt when we first met all those years ago. The new map has worked so well for us that we wrote a book called A New Map for Relationships. Oh, and by the way, we didn't have a single fight doing that either. We had disagreements, but we didn't fight over it. We came up with a holistic solution. The new map's holistic thinking can work wonders at ending pain at home and war in the world. The first step is to believe that it's possible, believe that peace is possible. And the next step, try the experiment. That's what she always tells me, to try the experiment. Try on the new map's holistic thinking for yourself. Isn't it time we got a new map that worked better than that old one? Thank you very much.